According to the UN Children's Agency, they had found that a significant number of girls and female adolescents have endured rape or some sort of sexual assault before the age of 20. The report says this is especially common in developing countries, but it also doesn't leave out wealthier developed nations either, with many girls reporting sexual victimization. Now, what about reporting when it factors into this? Well, data shows that nearly half of all girls aged 15 to 19 who had faced physical and or sexual violence did not report it. Now, this report didn't just cover sexual violence against girls, but also violence and abuse towards children overall. Now, Anthony Lake, who's UNICEF's director, said violence against children occurred every day, everywhere. And while it harms individual children the most, it also tears at the fabric of society, undermining stability and progress. But violence against children is not inevitable. It is preventable if we refuse to let violence remain in the shadows. Now, he also goes on to say that these are uncomfortable facts. No governmental parent will want to see them. But unless we confront the reality each infuriating statistic represents, the life of a child whose right to a safe, protected childhood has been violated. We will never change the mindset that violence against children is normal and permissible. It is neither. Now, there's a lot of disturbing statistics and findings in this study. I just want to ask the panel, what did you find the most disturbing?
I think the most disturbing thing about this, I think a lot of, at least fairly well-educated people think this sort of thing, yes, we have an idea that it's going on, and we all kind of think, okay, we know it's an issue, there are other issues that we kind of think that we should deal with more, but it's just the sheer scale of the numbers and just percentages, number of females being kind of attacked. And let's not forget, there's physical abuse, there's also mental and psychological abuse, and there's also neglect of children as well. There's a whole different series of categories in the manner in which children can be abused. And I know this looked at kind of people under the age of 20, and while some of them aren't necessarily classed as children, they are still suffering a huge amount. And certainly in terms of the female statistics, and I think also just the young kids to a lesser extent as well, it's going to be something slightly controversial, but I think a lot of the blame comes to religion as well. I really do honestly believe that, because it is in a lot of the developing countries. When you look at the statistics where they point towards countries such as Brazil, kind of the South American countries, look at countries in India and kind of Southeast Asia, kind of some of the most highly religious countries in the world seem to have some of the worst statistics. And okay, you can't see cause and effect, but there is certainly some correlation between the religiosity of a country and the amount of abuse that most notably women and young women are receiving in those countries. And so I know it's controversial, but I do think that there's going to be some form of connection there.
I think that blaming religion is a superficial excuse, especially for LDCs, because if you look at lesser developed countries, it's not just that they're also highly religious, they also don't have an educational structure. They don't have any structure where they have comprehensive health care for anybody, let alone women, and that's a big problem. And we also fail to look at a lot of what's fueling this, just like any other illegal trade, is the Western countries, just like drugs. It's the Westerners who are looking for these young kids to abuse, and it's we'll blame LDC for their actions within the country. Like, okay, in Africa, because Africa was one of the the continents that they were using as an example, how certain girls were getting forced to have sex. But you also got to understand that a lot of the countries in Africa have been systematically dismantled so that they cannot develop, so that there's no way for a girl to learn about anything outside of being the use of a man. And that's not religion. You don't really need religion to put somebody in that mindset or to put a culture into that narrative. You just need to have poverty, really. I think that's the most important aspect of this, not so much religion.
Religion isn't the only cause of this abuse. I'm certainly not saying that at all, but there are good cases to be made. I'm not going to make them now just for the sake of time, but religion can contribute towards kind of a lack of education, certainly within countries, having an education infrastructure in a country. The number of passages in the Bible that are against education, certainly of women. It also does contribute towards poverty as well. And I'm not saying it's the sole contribution towards the poverty in the country, and that it's all intertwined. But I certainly think religion is a large node within that sphere of contribution towards the systematic abuse of women and children in those countries.
I would disagree, because if you look at there are certain religions that, if you look at the religion of Islam, it's one of the only religions that promotes education. Long ago, I mean, Islam invented universities, the idea of having an institution that educated the masses. So you can't necessarily say that religion has a large part in it. I think that that's a good way to oversimplify the issue, which is that these girls are living in countries where they can't go to school, nobody's going to school, nobody has a job, there's no real structure of a governing body where it's corrupt. So it's like you have this overall system and culture in these lesser developed countries where everybody's helpless. Nobody gets to eat, nobody has running water, and a basic social order will take place, an agrarian social order will take place, and that can happen completely without religion. Now, I'm not saying that religion is completely absolved of any kind of weight into the situation, but I don't think that it's as large of a factor as that a lot of people like to push on.
Yeah, the key word that Haven used, and it was what I've been trying to say this whole time, is culture, 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 culture. Like like poverty and sexual assault, religion and sexual assault. Like, to me, it's like they might be justifications or whatever, but it really has nothing. It really does not have that much to do with it. We know in this country that if you're an atheist, rich frat boy, like you could be just as likely to rape a woman as any other person in America. Maybe more so because you have that sense of entitlement and that lack of respect for women. And that really is not like a unique thing to uniquely religious countries. I mean, Uganda is on this list at like on a ridiculous number of 50% in Uganda, and they're recently passing all those anti-gay laws to be, holier than thou. But just because they're doing that at the same time does not mean they're connected. Poverty might play a part in human sex trafficking, but like this is overall abuse and sex trafficking included. Like it's not all one and the same. So. Like, it's really about culture. If you have a culture that doesn't respect women, even if you're a developing country, because we know by the surveys, not this particular survey in this particular instant, the worst country for women statistically is India, right? And India is a developing economy, but they went out over Saudi Arabia because it's about the culture. It's not about wealth. It's not about economic development. If you have a culture that, I mean, some of it's about wealth and all that, but it's really about the culture. If you have a culture that doesn't respect women, that doesn't view them as equal, they will be more likely to treat them as property and not as equal. It's like the most obvious thing in the world. And the thing that upset me about this study the most is obviously the high numbers in certain countries, the 1 in 10 overall of people under 20. But the thing that I like the best about this study is something Stephen and I usually get into on the show, is that they properly, in my opinion, separated statistics for assault, rape, and harassment and stuff like that. And we run into a lot of these studies where the numbers will look inflated and they won't be separated properly. That is not the case. This study is bad as it seems.
I think one solution that could be used as an example, I don't know if you guys know who Mohammed Yunus is, but back in a couple of years ago, the IMF was trying to develop these countries, especially in India, since we're on that topic, and they came to realize that they spent all these years trying to develop a country, essentially keeping half of the population out of any kind of say-so in it, which were the women. And this is the IMF. This is not some religious faction. This is a Western institution that had this kind of ignorance. And it wasn't until this man came along and came with a brand new idea of how to attack building a financial system. He created the Grameen Bank, which was very micromanaged, and it was handled by the women in the society, and they saw a greater progress in those communities than anything that the IMF has done. So it's like we need to not just respect women, but involve women. I mean, you can't change a society when you only have half of the people doing all the work and doing all the thinking. You need multiple different perspectives.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I'll quote Christopher Hitchens. He said kind of the best way to improve any economy, to get any country out of poverty, is the empowerment of women. You just give them a little bit of education, and heck, if you can throw in a bit of money or a couple of seeds or whatever, that raises the floor of the entire country to the nth degree. And so you're right. You do have to you can't just try and teach the men in society, don't do this, this is bad. You've got to empower the women to basically make them realize, because in a lot of these countries, they just expect it to happen to them. It's just part of that cultural mindset. And without backtracking too much, I think a lot of these kind of cultural identities and cultures that these countries have, they identify with a certain religion. So if you look at kind of Indonesia and those sort of countries, they have a Christian culture out there. So I do think religion, again, I think it does play a large part of it. It's not the only part, but I think it's one of the larger parts, because, as quote Hitchens again, religion does tend to poison and seep through into every single aspect of society and culture. So that's why I think it does play a part. But I think we both agree that the empowerment of women is probably the greatest priority in helping solve this, really tragic issue.